All right, everyone, it's hit 4 p.m., so I'll kick off now. My name is Rohan Hazel. I'm the managing director of GIFT.ed, and it is great to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today for GIFT.ed's Touchstone webinar series, where we bring together some of the world's leading experts to discuss the key issues of the day. And today we are joined by Dr. Edward Se and Chandra Nair in China's next leap forward, beyond AI and why now? So, of course, we all recognize the accelerating pace of technological change, but I think it might also be fair to say that actually very few appreciate the profound and multifaceted transformation that's taking place in China at the moment with regard to technology and its relationship to China's civilizational history. What we miss, in fact, is that civilizational history. It's not just China's economy that's driving artificial intelligence and the technological boom, but it's not even just market forces. But actually, there's a unique civilizational blend of governance, economic planning, and social philosophy. So this convergence has created an environment that not only accelerates technological innovation on one hand, but it also drives a broader vision on the other, of course, inclusive long-term growth. So as I say, we're joined by two thought leaders today to help us unravel the layers of this transformation, which is really sitting at the heart of many of the geopolitical complexities of the day. So of course, we have Dr. Edward Se, the former head of BCG China, and who has been described as one of the country's greatest strategic thinkers. And of course, he's joined by GIFT.ed's own Chandra Nair, our chairman and founder. So it promises to be a really thought-provoking discussion, and you will get the opportunity to share your questions in the chat. So please do so. The team will take note of them, and I will share them with Chandran personally so that he can ask Dr. Se and get stuck into some of your thoughts and opinions as well. So without further ado, Chandra, I'll hand over to you, and you can kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohan, for the good kind introduction. Edward, if you don't mind me calling you by your first name, thank you. I've known Dr. Se for about 30 years, I think, and we reconnected in the last couple of years. So it's a pleasure to have you. To all of you who have dialed in from around the world, I know we have people from Europe, even North America, tuning in across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. A warm welcome. I appreciate you joining us, and I hope you'll find this hour extremely interesting. So what we'll try and do is I will invite Dr. Se to make a few opening remarks, lay out his arguments about what is going on in China. And to kick that off, I'd just like to, put this in context of why we're here. I think it's fair to say that most of the world's consumed by hot wars, Ukraine, Gaza, of course, Sudan, and other places, and then cold wars, which are better than hot wars, which is a trade war. It's interesting how trade wars have essentially sidelined the hot wars, which are a lot more lethal than the trade wars. I'd always rather have a trade war than a hot war. But it's interesting how trade wars have consumed us in terms of the media focus, etc. And then there is that story about tech. And I invited Dr. Se because we met in December, and he mentioned to me the week that the strange little company called DeepSeek was appearing on headlines. And he asked me over a cup of coffee, have you heard of this DeepSeek? And I said, what a strange name, DeepSeek. And of course, the following week, it was all over the world. And we had a very good conversation. And he said to me that this is much bigger than tech, much bigger than AI. And this is why we chose the title, that China's Great Leap Forward Beyond AI and Why Now. And really the focus was that he enlightened me into, although I've been watching China, living in Hong Kong, went to China when, most of the people in Beijing were still on bicycles. There was no Mercedes-Benz cars and four-wheel drives or EVs. And, think I knew. But when he started saying to me, why do you think it's happening now? I thought I must have Dr. Edward Se on our program the next time. So Ed, let me, invite you to kind of paint a picture. You've been a close observer, particularly given your extensive knowledge of China from your consulting days. I know you have your own advisory firm now in China. working with some of the leading tech firms, etc. I had the privilege of joining a workshop you held 2-3 weeks ago in China with some of these tech companies. Please, for those who have tuned in, who may have not followed the history of China, but think, and there's so much media attention on China, sadly, most of it negative. Please paint a picture of where you think things stand today, particularly in terms of that question you asked me. Why do you think it's happening now when I said, hey, what's happening with all this tech stuff in China? So over to you.
Thank you, Chandran. And thank you, Rohan. It's very nice to meet you, Rohan, the first time. Also, Chandran, really a pleasure getting to know you for over 30 years, and over the last couple of years, a lot more conversation and interactions. Appreciate the opportunity very much. And as we discussed last time, Chandran, as I work across China, two issues are very much on the top of minds for my business clients or business people in general. One is, of course, the current tariffs or the tariffs war, trade war, that kind of stuff. The other is actually AI. These two issues, they don't seem to be, the same thing. In fact, they seem to be quite different. But actually, as you already alluded to earlier, Chandran, they're actually quite connected. Most people recognize now that China is an innovative nation. But as you know very well, that wasn't the case even slightly more than a decade or so ago. But today, I say in general, people around the world have come to realize that China is actually quite innovative. But there's a hiccup along the way. Since OpenAI appeared a couple of years ago, actually at that time, there was a general sense of despair within the Chinese business community, and particularly the tech community, because the Chinese actually, before OpenAI showed up, the Chinese were quite confident and say, hey, we're on our way, we're doing innovations, and, we do a lot of internet type business model innovations, and, many of them were very successful. All of a sudden, there was an OpenAI. And the tech entrepreneurs in China were saying, wow, these guys are pretty good, and we are nowhere. So what does it mean? So there's a general sense of despair. But fast forward a couple of years later, as you mentioned, Chandran, last time we spoke, DeepSeek came out. I think the fact that DeepSeek came out around the Spring Festival time of China, that really changed a lot of things. And I think the reason many of you already know, but it really helped rejuvenate the confidence of the Chinese business community, in particular the tech community, about China's ability to innovate, in particular in the AI area, but increasingly, but also AI plus its applications. In China, while people are aware of the importance of AI, many of them are still at a relatively early stage to think about the far-reaching implication of AI to the businesses. But some of them are beginning to try to figure out what are the fundamental impact to businesses, that AI will generate for them and for others across the spectrum. In our view, AI will lead some fundamental changes for businesses, and a lot of them will start from China, and that's actually already happening. The forum that you mentioned, Chandran, that we undertook on the 19th of April, several weeks ago, that I think you caught some of those kind of conversation or discussions on how the Chinese business people are beginning to think about the fundamental impact of AI to businesses. And it's not just the usage of AI in businesses, but the fundamental impact. What do I mean by that? We discussed a lot, as you remember, Chandran, about how AI could lead to redefinition of what the industry is, even what the enterprise would be defined or should be defined in the future. And also, we discussed a lot about the fundamental of impact of AI in the definition of organizational structure, processes, as well as capabilities, as well as the definition on what human talents ought to become in the new AI era. In my view, the Chinese companies are in the lead for this. They haven't figured out what the full set of answers is, but they are trying to figure it out. And as always, while a large number of businesses are trying to search for the answer for some question, a small percentage of them will get to them faster and earlier than someone else. And a small percentage of a large number would still be a large number on the global scale. And so that's one, is how AI could fundamentally impact the redefinition of fundamental definition of what business is going to be. Two is that as we work across many sectors with many clients in China, we also are now finding that China will also be the lead. It will be in the lead in AI plus other technologies, such as robotics, automation, and will happen across many sectors, not only in the so-called tech sectors, but the application will happen in sectors such as consumer products, in energy, in big farm, in big health or pharma, in also retail, also all sorts of industries. We're going to see new applications of AI, and that will happen a lot in China. But people would still ask why China is able to grow so readily and become innovative in such a short time. The question that I posed to you last time: why China? Why now? And why was China able to do this despite external challenges? As we know, it's not just today. Actually, since the first era of Donald Trump and the Joe Biden era, and now, of course, Donald Trump #2, China is not short of external challenges, but yet it looks like China continues to grow in some kind of manner and exhibit significant resilience. And the question again is, why is that? I believe that there's an internal logic to why China is able to grow, and why China is able to exhibit a high level of resilience. And I think there are actually three fundamental reasons. And I believe I described to you briefly, Chandran, what I thought those three reasons are. And I will just very quickly go through them without going into a lot of details. But I think it's important to point out the fundamental reasons so that I think our audience will have a bit better appreciation of the underlying and internal logic. One is China's governance system, which is a system which is described as a three-layer duality. A three-layer duality, meaning China's governance system includes three layers. What do I mean by three layers? Of course, at the top would be the central government in Beijing. Beijing defines and create directions for the overall policies for China. We know that every 5 years there's a 5-year plan generated in Beijing, and that will be the direction or the strategic plan for China for the 5 years. And that is a part of the governance. At the bottom, if one can call it a bottom, but maybe not a bottom, but there are numerous number of Chinese businesses. Many of them are SOEs or state-owned, but larger number, actually the predominant number of businesses are actually privately owned. And many of the most successful companies that we know as of today, like Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, Xiaomi, are all privately owned. So I think to a lot of people, maybe outside of Greater China, they need to understand that China is not a state-owned economy. It is both a state-owned as well as a privately owned or non-state-owned economy. That would be the businesses, I say, so-called at the bottom. But in the middle are the local governments at the city level or provincial level. And these governments play a very important role because they make the connections between the central government's policies and the directions, as well as the businesses. Many resourceful local governments, such as Shenzhen, Shanghai, Hangzhou, which is very popular these days, Suzhou, and you've been there just recently too, in places even like Chengdu. I mean, these governments are very resourceful, and they are also very business friendly. They would support businesses to to incubate them, to support them with funding, and so on and so forth, give them sort of also incorporate them into the business ecosystem so that, companies can have upstream suppliers and also in the downstream in the customers. So the role of the local government is also very important. It's this three-layer system that work in synchronization that is one part of the governance system. The other part is, of course, the dual economic structure, which includes both the SOEs and the privately owned companies that I mentioned already. SOEs have a lot of issues, but SOE plays a major role because they contribute a lot to the Chinese basic infrastructure development. They have a social responsibility to fulfill. And so, as we travel across China, we enjoy the most modern infrastructure, like high-speed rail, like the 5G network, like probably the world's most advanced electricity grid, generation grid, that kind of stuff. They are all built by the SOEs. The SOE's economic formula is very different than the economic formula of a privately owned companies. And it's that combination of an SOE which have a social responsibility, plus the privately owned companies, by definition, they're profit driven. That combination create a dual economic structure which provides, in a way, a source of resilience. Second is the Chinese inclination and practice of practicing experimentation, learning, and adaptations since its reform and opening up for some 40 years ago. I think you may remember Chandran, when Deng Xiaoping, returned to power, he was actually saying, I don't know what the grand plan is, but let's just give it a try and see how it goes, right? Let's see, how does it work? And Hong Kong actually, Shenzhen was actually picked as one of a special economic zones because he wanted to try market economy in Shenzhen and use it as a pilot zone and see how it worked. And boom, of course it worked, right? And so once a certain number of experiments begin to work, the Chinese learn about it, pick up some good experiences, maybe dispose some of the bad experiences, and then they move on and expand the experiments to a larger scale until it becomes a nationwide practice. It happens over and over again over the last 40 years. And that has become a part of the DNA of how the Chinese government sort of practices its policies. The third reason, I think, is China's ability to organize, or let me put it this way. The third reason is China's large-scale organization and coordination skills. It's incredible. How the Chinese government, in particular local governments, are able to mobilize and marshal resources towards a certain goal. I think today we know that China has become the world's largest manufacturing nation. And a lot of the manufacturing is not so-called only the so-called labor-intensive manufacturing. Many of them are very sophisticated and high-end manufacturing that requires a lot of sophistication in coordination and organizing multiple number of suppliers working through a set of very sophisticated processes to create reliable and on-time output of highly sophisticated manufactured products. This requires an underlying set of capabilities. And the Chinese local governments is really good in doing that. That wasn't the case, actually, even, as late as, let's say, 70, 80 years ago in China. China was known. In fact, Dr. Sun Yat-sen have once called China, or the Chinese, we Chinese, as a batch of loose ends. We couldn't work together. We were totally disorganized. That was very true. But he lived, let's say, by now, 100 years ago, right? But over the last 40 odd years, China really have made significant improvement on that. And today, I say China has world-class capabilities. In particular, the Chinese institutions have world-class capabilities in organizing this, because manufacturing just don't come out from a vacuum. it come out with a backdrop of this kind of capabilities, both organizationally, but also world-class infrastructure that I mentioned earlier already, which were built largely by the SOEs. So these are the fundamental reasons. But more, if we take it even a step back, this is the point that Chandran, maybe you wanted me to talk a little bit today. And I wanted to take, a few minutes, if you don't mind, Chandran, if you still have time.
Please,
And I want
please
to
go
touch
ahead.
on that a little bit. Because I think this is a part where perhaps most people don't get. But I think it's very important for people from around the world to really understand. It is that what we're now seeing today is a reflection of a long process. This long process, I can quickly synthesize it into, let's say, the last 200 years, or something like 200 years. Since nearly 200 years ago, different generations of the Chinese elites has been searching for ways to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. I think I would assume that all of you knew what happened in 1840, and I wouldn't talk too much about that, but I think you should know what happened in 1840. That's a big deal for the Chinese. And since the 1840, different generations of the Chinese elites are thinking about how could we rejuvenate our nation? And there are many different efforts along the way. Or the other way I would call this is how the Chinese elites in different generations have been searching for a modernity with Chinese characteristics. How China can become modern, but within the Chinese context, right? So this process has been quite tumultuous, actually, along the way, often with some ups, some progress, but also often with some regress. It's been very tumultuous, and all the way until the formation of the PRC in 1949. And of course, as we know, that was a milestone for the Chinese as well. The formation of the PRC in 1949 provided a new approach, which addressed some of the fundamental flaws of the previous approaches of the Chinese search for modernity. But of course, it also introduced plenty of tumultuous experiences too, in particular during the first 30 years of the PRC. But the reform and opening up that started in the late 1970s, early 80s was a fresh start for the Chinese. And with multiple strands of thoughts originating from more than 2,000 years ago, Chinese civilization is actually diversified, highly diversified. While Confucianism was a dominating school of thought, other schools of thought such as legalism, Taoism, Buddhism, and others were also very prevalent along the way. They never disappeared, actually, in the Chinese DNA. The schools of the strategists, militarists, logicians, yin and yang also have the influence over the years, over the different generations of the Chinese. Since the Han Dynasty, the Chinese had taken on Buddhism from India and integrated that into the Chinese thoughts. So I always say, part of the Chinese actually Indians, because Indian thoughts through Buddhism is such a big part of the Chinese way of thinking, even today. And more recently, as you know, since about 100 years ago, the Chinese took on Marxism or began to learn about Marxism. And even more recently, the Chinese took on the principles of market economy and incorporate that into the governance system. So today, the Chinese system is a composite of many different schools of thought. Most of them are originally from China, but many actually are not. They are borrowed and learned from foreign countries, including India, but also including Western countries. It is that ability to be willing to be inclusive and fundamentally diversified and be willing to be adaptive that, in my view, fundamentally define the backdrop on why China has been able to do what it's been able to do in the last 40 years, in particular in the last 10 or 12 years. I think is very important. To your point, Jonathan, over the long history of China, we have seen over and over again that whenever there's a reasonable period of stability in the Chinese history, China will inevitably become one of the world's biggest, if not the largest, economic power across our whole history of something like several thousands of years. It happens over and over again. I think we're now despite the external challenges, we're actually now in that period of a reasonable stability that enable the Chinese people, in particular the Chinese entrepreneurs, and in particular the young Chinese people who aspire to be entrepreneurs, that stable environment that they can sit down, think about issues, go and find some, funding, either from the government or from other private investors, do some innovation, incorporate technologies such as AI, robotics, automation, and blockchain, all the other stuff, and apply that into specific business scenarios. And China has the world's most extensive number of scenarios because of the industry infrastructure that they have built. So I want to close with just a conclusion. So Chandran, and then we can have maybe some Q&A. So in conclusion, my view is that China's resilience and pursuit for progress is the result of a near 200 years of collective reflection on how to achieve modernity in China and for China. What we are seeing today is the collective will of the Chinese people on the entire nation, back up in history, culture, and civilization of diversity, inclusiveness, and adaptation. I believe that I believe we're entering into a new world of multipolarity. In this new world, China's role will become even more important. China's continued growth and impact to the rest of the world will be a major factor in shaping how the world will function going forward. Thank you, Jonathan.
Edward, thank you so much. An amazing array of viewpoints, spanning history. And there's so much here that I would like to ask you. The questions are now coming in fast. What I'm going to do is just probe with 2 or 3 questions. If you could, if you don't mind, keep it short. I think the opening gave us a lot, but I will probe a few things I think which will be good for the audience, and then I'll go to the questions that we're getting from the audience as well. One of the things that has also astounded a lot of people with all these new companies coming up. And it's in a way funny that it should astound people, but and I want to move beyond the technology space as well. But the last tech-related question here is, many people were kind of, I've had friends in Europe say, where were these people trained? And did they go to MIT, Harvard, and all of that? And so, as we know, a lot of the new entrepreneurs are all Chinese trained. I think you mentioned to me that the founder of one of the most advanced robotic humanoids companies is actually doesn't even speak a word of English, etc. So could you just, for the audience, explain the quality of the universities as well, and how that has developed over the last, given that there was so much lack of stability, say 50, 60 years ago, how these universities have become world beaters, and who are these students, and why is it that, how's the timing such that they are the creators, and they didn't go to the business schools or the tech universities in the US, Europe, etc. A quick response to just edify the audience.
Yeah, the person you mentioned is the CEO of Unitree, which is a robotics company called Wang Xingxing. His English was not that great, and because of that, he wasn't able to get into within China, even the best school in China. So he graduated from what people call the second best or the third best kind of schools in China. But nonetheless, his company is doing extremely well, and he's extremely innovative. But you're right, if you look at even for the founder of DeepSeek, Liang Wenfeng, he's a graduate of Zhejiang University. and he never had to spend time outside of China from the study standpoint. And that has become quite a trend now. It doesn't mean that people don't need to study overseas from MIT, Harvard, and so on. Of course, these universities continue to generate very, very high talent, and so you know, we don't mean to sort of say, you know, this university is no good anymore, but it's also a fact that many of the leading Chinese entrepreneurs, and particularly the younger entrepreneurs, actually didn't have to go overseas, and you know, they get very good education, stay on China, and leverage the Chinese business environment with the conditions that I mentioned, and they're able to find the niche, and you know, and able to be successful. So why is that actually? I think it's still back to the fundamental conditions that I mentioned, is that once you could give the Chinese people a reasonable period of stability, the Chinese will figure out what to do. Fundamentally, Chinese are very curious people. They would sort of search for ways to always keep on improving. And education is one of the areas, but not the only area. But certainly in education, there's been a lot of effort being, you know, provided by many different people to try to so-called improve the education. But I wouldn't say it is really so-called improving the education. It is to, what should I say, to make the academic institutions development commensurate with the pace and the nature of the development of the country, in particular in terms of innovation. And I would put it this way. So education moves in commensurate with the development of the rest of the country. And you know, many of these universities have very good foundations. Previously, they may not have the enough funding. Maybe the system or the governance wasn't the best. But over time, the Chinese learn, adapt, improve some here, improve some there, and then they learn along the way. So this is what we're seeing now. So this is really not a surprise. But at the same time, we don't want to, you know, undermine the importance of, you know, graduating or learning from the top-notch international universities from the US or from Europe.
Absolutely. I mean, the importance of providing opportunities whereby, you know, young people from all over the world can exchange and go to the best universities with your choice wherever the world is something so important. One thing I'd like to just quick response as well, you know, that stability issue is something that also struck me as something that perhaps not enough people understand, and how that relates to the Chinese position on foreign policy. Can you just take a couple of minutes to explain that? Is this why China is, though, you know, some parts of the world, and dare I say, particularly in the United States, etc., you know, can't believe that China will not be an aggressive force? And I'm not here to say that I can predict what China will do, or any of us can. But when you mentioned to me that stability is key, then I thought, is this why China is so patient, despite all the outward pressures, and dare I say, even some provocation, because it cherishes the stability, the peace, because that it recognizes is the foundation for economic growth, and the rise of, you know, leaving behind the desperation of the past.
That's why I think you already sort of give the answer that I wanted to give. So I won't repeat what you said. But I just want to take a step back and sort of mention in the Chinese history, there actually is two schools of thought on how to, you know, how to provide national governance. One is the school of thought, we call it Wang Dao and Ba Dao. Wang Dao and Ba Dao. Wang Dao is like, you know, you need to treat others well, and you need to treat others as equal, and so on and so forth. So that's a more benevolent kind of way of thinking about itself, or also in its relationship with the other countries or other nations. The other is Ba Dao. Ba Dao is bullyism. Bullyism, right? You know, you try to bully other people because you know that you're strong, and you can bully other people. And over the thousands of years of history, we actually have different periods of different rulers who adopt different approaches. So it's not like, okay, the Chinese just nice people and we treat people. I think we all human beings. But I think uh China is, but also all the people are, or all the countries are. Everyone is looking out for their own interest first and foremost. And I think the the long history of China and the civilization culture actually have taught China a lot, and given us a lot of data to rely on. Some of the data is very good. In certain periods, China is doing really well, but in many other periods, China wasn't doing that well either. So for the Chinese, we got a lot of data that we can rely on and that will reflect upon. And especially, over the last 70 years, and especially over the last 40 years, and also more recently in the last 12, 13 years, I think the Chinese were looking at what's going on today. At the same time, they will also look back in our reservoir of knowledge and data. And we say, what is in the best interest of us? What should we do so that we can achieve our purpose with the minimum amount of risk and with the high level of certainty? And I believe that the choice of taking on a more collaborative and more inclusive agenda is the result of that. And I think you know uh, you can never say never, but I think uh, from Beijing's standpoint, the willingness and the ability to collaborate with other nations, including America, by the way, is on the national agenda, and and a willingness and a goal to achieve a community of shared destiny for the humankind is also a major goal, as you know, for today's Beijing government. So I think that's what I see, Chandran.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you as someone who's both worked globally with largest multinationals to really tell this audience too something that people I think sometimes take with a pinch of salt when you say that a key objective of the Chinese government is to attempt to shape a world in where the shared human destiny is something that all nations commit to. And in a cynical world which we live in today, when you say one of the world's one of the rising power, etc., has this objective, most people view it with cynicism and think it's propaganda. But as you say, we can never predict. But that's something I've also observed, and at the moment anyway, the actions of the Chinese government seem to suggest that. So my last question on technology, then we can open up the floor, etc. Given that technology is double-edged, particularly the advances we're seeing today, and with AI and the fears that much of this technology will be used for surveillance, military use, and captured by the state, etc. It's a question I've often pondered, and I think I alluded to in that conference. Why is there a danger that China will fall into the trap? And what role does the state play in terms of the tech game becoming a competition, a zero-sum game with the USA? Why should China even enter that race? So, it's there is the view that it's racing because it wants to be seen by the world as we're the top dog in town, even on technology. But if we have the technology, then we can protect ourselves. But the other aspect of the shared humanity side of these things are the dangers that, as you've already alluded to, tech can create. So what is your view? And I've been asked by a couple of people as well, why compete on technology, and why compete with the USA? And what's the technology for a nation like China, which has so many other challenges itself to face?
Yeah, I'm not sure China's stance is to try to compete with the US and technology. I think the Chinese have already developed their own policy, which I mentioned, every 5 years there's a 5-year plan. And at least in the last several 5-year plan, so-called high quality growth is mentioned as a major pillar for Chinese strategy. And it comes from how the Chinese government view the future of China. And so high quality growth actually implies, technological innovation as the main driver for the growth of the Chinese economy going forward. So from that standpoint, I'm not sure competing with the US is a necessarily important part or even a part of that. But of course, by definition, as you try to be better, people will say, well, then there's competition. And sure enough, there's of course the competition. Uh, in my view, that kind of notion is almost inevitable because, China will have to continue to do what it thinks is the good for them. But I believe that we're also now seeing that China is not monopolizing those kind of technology. China is trying to export those technologies through collaborating, working with other nations who are willing to collaborate and work with China. As an example, Chandran, you're from Malaysia. President Xi Jinping went to Malaysia, also Vietnam and Cambodia not too long ago. And when the leaders met, they signed a lot of deals by working together. A lot of those kind of deals are related to technology or technology enable industry development. And so from that standpoint, I think certainly there's a beneficial side of the tech development side. But whether or not people see that as competition to US, then of course it depends on your perspective. Uh, but but technology, in particular AI, inherently also have a downside, which you mentioned already too. That downside can be manifested in many dimensions. One is certainly from a military standpoint. The other is from the standpoint of ethical or ethics. Many of my clients in China are asking the question that, since I can adopt AI, that means that I have to lay off people. And is that a problem, right? Should I do that? Should I not do that? I think those kind of issues are also a bit of a concern for many corporate leaders in China. So yeah, there's two sides to technology, in particular AI. And I think these are common issues that many people have to grapple with, including people in China.
Thank you, Ed. And before I start with the questions coming out there, I think at that conference I did ask the question about the sort of what some of the tech leaders talked about, the need for critical thinking and the need for ethical boundaries. And I asked them if they were all living in their own echo chamber. And I was pleasantly surprised with the kind of intellectual open response where people did say, yeah, we need to question the frameworks within which we work. And I think that's a solid basis for the challenges, the ethical, the moral issues. And I do think, and we will have you back hopefully in a couple of years to talk about, where will the Chinese government intervene when it comes to the sort of societal impacts, labor, etc., when it comes to technology displacing labor. So here's one of the first questions that I've been posted here. And it relates back to this issue of you talked about high quality growth in China and that being a catalyst for more than just technology development. So the question is, how do you see the new quality productive forces, something that perhaps people not familiar with China may not fully be aware of, but this new quality productive forces agenda play a role in China's next leap? Is it a follow-up to Made in China, which had its geopolitical consequences, or is it a more fundamental change for the whole of China? I think a bit of your views on that would be extremely useful because it goes beyond just AI and things like that.
High quality productive forces is an acronym for is an acronym for technological innovation, and the way that is manifested is actually through technologies such as AI, but also robotics, automation, and the combination. Actually, importantly, is the combination. It is actually to take advantage of technology or other production factors to fundamentally improve the productivity of activities within the society, like in China's case. So is a was I say is an outgrowth of the idea of high quality growth, or maybe it's a part of the high quality growth that more specifically touches on what are the fundamental drivers, as well as the mechanisms or tools that the Chinese can take on to continuously improve the level of productivity within the system.
Here's another question. Given the history of China, how is this new period of, the rising China, you put the historical context, this period of the rise of China change global geopolitics? I think many will have different views about this, but do you see the diversity of thoughts adopted in China, the experimentation, the openness to new ideas, particularly the eco-civilization discussion with President Xi has, even said he's drawn a red line, and I forget the exact quote, but he said if you cross that red line, it would be completely unacceptable. How do you think that will change China, and how will it impact the global economy as a whole?
What would change China?
This whole new part of the Chinese emphasis on high quality development, but at the same time the emphasis on eco-civilization, for instance, and just people might be interested. I was very intrigued that when I flew on Sichuan Airlines, that they actually said you can have a green flight and not order any food. It's the first time and I've always advocated that why do they dump food on me when I don't even want to eat it? So these sorts of measures that have been taking place, and even in hotels where they're not offering you any amenities at all, no toothpaste, no brush, you bring your own. So that sort of eco-civilization push, which at least in the world I sort of engage with some people, China is pushing very hard. I mean, most people know it from just the point of view of the e-cars and the solar panels, etc., but it's much more profound. And that's also technology enabled, but it's also policy very much. So how is it changing China? I saw it in terms of you don't get toothbrushes and toothpaste in some of the hotels in Shanghai, and you can go onto airplanes. There's no meals if you don't want it, and it's called a green flight. So, and given what you said about the Chinese government's ability to put foresight into planning and then scale it up, how do you see those changes taking place, and how will it be enabled by the new productive forces and technology?
Incredible changes have been happening, Chandran, as you described. But since you've been visiting China for several decades, I'm sure you remember it wasn't that long ago that let's say when you went to Beijing, the sky was dark and so
Oh, yes.
right, pollution is incredible and so on. So you remember all those days, right? That wasn't that long ago. That was like 12, 13 years ago.
Yes.
But now every time when you go to Beijing, is most of the time is blue sky. I mean, it's incredible change. And as you also know, Chandran, China probably plants more trees than any other countries in the world.
Yeah.
And they have we vegetate large parts of deserts in the northern part and northwestern part of China, probably more than any other countries in the world, right? And so this eco development is large scale, but also very minute, like what you described, what happened in your daily life when you travel on the aircraft, when you go to a hotel, just everyday life, you see that change. In China, I'm sure I'm sure you have noticed, China, even if you go to the biggest cities like Shanghai or Chengdu, you don't hear that much of noises anymore, especially automotive noises.
It's
What
gone.
wasn't the case
It's
even
gone.
10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Very quiet. basic environment is very quiet, which is very different than many other developing countries in the world that you know very well, Tanduan, right? And that again, only happens in a short period of time. I think, first of all, situation like what we just described, even just a decade ago, I think everyone, including the leaders in the political leaders in Beijing, they all recognized at that time that that wasn't sustainable. Things have to be changed. Things have to improve. And so let's go about doing it, right? Let's doing it. And so there's various plans, there are various programs and so on. And just, in little more than a decade, you see the result of that. And this is a result of what I mentioned earlier. The third point, which is this large scale organization and coordination capability. A lot of these kind of things requires coordination, requires organization. It is not just one person who is a hero and say, well, let me, clean up the air for Beijing. It doesn't happen that way. It requires a lot of coordination by many people, many organizations, institutions, but working, synchronously against a certain goal. And I think in the general area of environmental improvement, the Chinese have done a lot in the last decade or so, and this is what you see. And I think the point that you mentioned reinforced the reasons or the line rationale for what I believe and why China is able to continue to grow with such level of resilience.
No, great point. And particularly coming back to your point about the three layers of government, the policy, and then at the base, the businesses, and in that middle, the state enterprises.
So local governments.
Local governments, sorry, and your wonderful explanation that the local governments are supposed to provide what we call the public goods and the social obligations that then allow. I mean, I was last week in Gansu province, up in the mountains in a small monastery town, which 15 years ago was when I first started going there, was like a lot of those towns, poor sanitation, etc. The whole place is sewered. And I took pictures of the streets that I couldn't find a single piece of waste paper, 100%. And I was not like looking to just, I looked everywhere. And I asked some government officials, and they said, well, it's rather easy. I said, how did you do this? He said, well, it's rather easy. Firstly, we have a lot of people in China. So they were slightly self-deprecating and said, so there's a lot of people looking for work. So we pay them, and many people want to just clean the streets and have a job, which is, interesting in the sort of how you look at the economy, the political economy. And then they said, but 10, 15 years ago, we started educating the children very early on about this. So those are the ability, as you said, for the state to organize on a large scale with a vision, then everyone aligns. And I was very impressed. I shared it with my housing association in Kuala Lumpur to say, here we are all middle-class people in KL, and why can't we do the same here? So hopefully we'll learn a few things from that. Here's a question. What do you think are some of the main misconceptions about the Chinese innovation model? I mean, we've all heard the accusations about China being, it's all state-driven, it's military funded, or it's copycat innovation. How does China move beyond, and how does the international community, those who are seeking to understand better, move beyond these stereotypes? And what can we learn from what China is doing, which clearly we can learn from every country. We can learn from the United States, we can learn from Europe, we can learn from Japan, etc. But the Chinese model still comes under the scrutiny about what are those guys doing? Are they copycats, etc.? And I have been watching very closely, and the examples of what I just cited at a very simple level for a small town. It's policy, it's execution, it's how do you look at labor, how do you unleash all that human capital. So what do you think of the main misconceptions that, for an international audience, people need to move beyond in terms of understanding China?
Well, at one stage, which was, let's say 2 decades ago, or maybe a little bit more than 2 decades ago, China was indeed a copycat, and China copied a lot. And But those were the days. But very quickly, China moved into learning to become innovative. Of course, it didn't become perfectly innovative in one night, in one shot. But over time, it also continued to improve. As we said, this learning, experimenting, learning, adapting, it applies not only to the government, but also to the Chinese people, especially to the entrepreneurs. So, it's not entirely misconception to say, China was a copycat or China stole intellectual property rights. Although I don't agree when people say, you know, people just China just simply stole IP. I don't think there's a national plan to steal IP, but certainly there were individuals who stole IP from foreign companies. That's not untrue. But those were the old days. That the old days was at least a couple of decades ago, and China have moved on. And China moved on mostly because of what I mentioned, the fundamental drivers that drive China's forward. And in this process, the Chinese were really trying very genuinely to make this progress by themselves, but also by collaborating with other people, working together with other people, and to generate this kind of progress. So, my advice to our friends across the world is that, yeah, I mean, you may have some ideas about China, but those ideas may be current, but may not be that current. I would say most likely they're not that current. So the best idea is to try to find out more about China. Best is to come to China, take a look and experience yourself. If not, then, listen to Chandran or other, people,
Oh, Edward,
right? So that's the idea.
thank you, Ed. So we've got about 5 minutes left. I got a couple of two more questions for you. And one is related to the issue, therefore, which I think we can't escape, but I should ask you to at least address. Where do you think this tariff war is going? I mean, China has said that coming to your point, we will not be bullied. We can stomach this. We can take the long road, the long road towards this. But if given you're a close watcher, you speak to business people all the time, the leading companies, what is your sense of where we will be in, say, 6 months? And I am putting you on the spot, but why not? Let's just see what you think where this is going.
Well, as I mentioned upfront, there are two issues on the top of the mind for the Chinese business people today. One is AI, the other is tariffs. And a lot of people are very concerned about tariffs. And they should be very concerned about tariffs because it looks like, every day there's some new development, there's some new changes. Today is 50%, tomorrow is 125, the other day is 225, and who knows what's the number for the next day, right? So there's too much volatility, and I think mainly all of us know that business work on certainty. When there's a lot of volatility or uncertainty, that's the worst for business decision makers. And I think that's the thinking process for many of the Chinese businessmen.
What about policymakers in China? I mean, given that there has been a strong position. And China is not the only one. Even the Canadians said, we will not budge. We will not be bullied. So in that sense, I think we all know that for business, this is horrible. It's torrid times. But at a geopolitical level, do you think a deal of sorts will be struck? And how soon? I'm putting you on the spot, but what are your sentiments?
Well, I think, Chandran, we spoke about that too. In fact, if you look at the Chinese economic development or performance since around 2018, when the first time the Donald Trump's trade war started with China and then through Joe Biden and up till now, actually, China's economic performance have not been too bad. China has been pretty good, actually, especially when measured by GDP by PPP. China has made incredible development over this period of time. And so, um, uh, first of all, China as of today is very different than China as of, let's say, 8 years ago. Very different. Second of all, is that China has picked up much more experience, having gone through the first round of the negotiation in the tariff dispute with the US the first time. So I think the Chinese are now much more, this time is much more ready, especially during the election. Already it's pretty clear who's going to come out. And so the Chinese have a pretty clear game plan for this already. And I think this game plan is being played out pretty meticulously since Donald Trump declared the tariff war. So what will happen in my view, in my view, well, first of all, I think it's already clear that we're now seeing there's a lot of shift in the diplomatic relationship across the board in many parts of the world. First of all, we already touched upon ASEAN countries earlier, and now ASEAN plus also Korea and Japan and China. I think that part is coming along, and of course we also have heard about the latest news about the renewed relationship between Europe and China. That also is now beginning to play out. You also mentioned about Canada's view and so on. So I think on the broader scale, we're already seeing the shifting of the global patterns, largely accelerated and because of Donald Trump's tariff tactics, right? In my view, these kind of tactics are not sustainable because behind all this is a range of business interests and other kind of interests. And these interests are affecting the US president's decisions on important issues such as tariffs and other things, trade and so on. And I think this interest will be manifesting more and more so because I think the interests behind the scene are beginning to, not beginning, they know for a long time the importance of China for them too. It's just a matter of how to play out the game. So I think the game will play out pretty quickly. I think there will be some kind of a deal, and that deal may not only be related to so-called tariffs, but could also relate to some other aspects such as investment. That would be my guess for the near-term future.
Ed, thank you so much. I feel slightly frustrated because I would like to have more of the conversation. I see from the audience numbers, hardly anyone's dropped out. People are staying. Usually 5 minutes before the end, people kind of vacate, but people are staying. So what I'll do is I promise to have you back if you will be so kind as to come back. We will invite you. But thank you so much. For those of you listening, I think you can all join me virtually in thanking Dr. Edward Sir for a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time, but I'm going to end now, Ed, and hand over to Rohan to close the session for us. Thank you so much. Rohan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Sir, for taking the time to speak with us. That was a really fantastic session. We will be sending out an email with all of the outcomes and discussion key points that Dr. Sir and Chandran spoke about. So thank you again. As a quick reminder before I close off, I know we're a little bit over time here, is that GIFT.ed, of course, is a global knowledge platform. So if you are a learner on the platform, I hope this has inspired you to continue learning. And if you're not with us on the platform, you can just drop us an email and we will be more than happy to discuss with you. So thank you so much, everyone. And we'll see you in the next Touchstone webinar.